My coworker pretended to be asleep on my shoulder until I moved to wake her. She was asleep. That was the story I was telling myself when I felt her shift for the third time in 20 minutes. Her head settled heavier against my shoulder, her breathing slow and even, and I sat perfectly still the way you do when a cat falls asleep on you and you don't want to ruin it. The train rocked. The lights in the carriage were the kind of dim that makes people honest. I told myself she was asleep. Then I moved to wake her, and she stopped breathing like that entirely. My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 34. I do project logistics for a mid-size construction firm. The kind of work that sounds important until someone asks you to explain it at a dinner party, and you watch their expression shift from polite interest to deeply reconsidering their life choices. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the kind of neighborhood that hasn't decided yet what it wants to be. I eat the same 3 meals in rotation. I own too many mugs. I'm not lonely exactly. I'm just someone who had gotten very good at not noticing things. Her name was Sophie Chiang. She was 32, our company's site coordinator, and she had been my professional nemesis for a year and a half. Not in a dramatic way, in the way where one person is meticulous and the other is efficient, and those two things are not the same thing, and every Monday morning stands as living proof. She had a clipboard she carried like it had wronged her personally. She made notes in the margins of project documents that were longer than the documents themselves. She drank tea from a specific mug, white, with a small blue bird on the handle, that lived on her desk and was not for anyone else to touch. I know this because I touched it once in September of last year. She has not forgotten. We met on Sophie's first week at the firm. She introduced herself at the site briefing, took one look at my project timeline, and said quietly, to no one in particular, that the third phase window was optimistic. I said the third phase window was realistic. She turned a page. I turned out to be wrong by 11 days. She has also not forgotten this. The existing dynamic was simple enough. We disagreed about almost everything professional. We were polite about it, and we had both quietly arrived at a system where we did better work together than apart, even though neither of us ever said that out loud. She caught my mistakes before they became problems. I pushed back on her timelines when they were impossible. It worked. I did not think about why. I was very good at not thinking about why. The work conference was in Bristol. 2 days, 1 overnight. We ended up on the same return train because we had both skipped the optional team dinner. Sophie had a migraine coming, she'd said. I just didn't want to watch Martin from procurement do impressions for 2 hours. We claimed seats across from each other by the window and worked in silence for the first hour, which is a thing I had apparently become comfortable enough with a person that it no longer felt strange. The carriage emptied out slowly. Somewhere around reading, the lights dimmed for the overnight stretch, and Sophie closed her laptop and said she was going to rest her eyes for a few minutes. That was 40 minutes ago. She had shifted twice in her seat, then once toward me, and somewhere in the drift of it her head had found my shoulder, and I had made the extremely rational decision to pretend this was a normal thing that happened in normal lives. The train smelled like stale air and someone's coffee from 2 rows back. Her hair was close enough that I could smell something like cedar and warm fabric. The window beside us was black and reflective, and in the glass I could see both of us, her face tipped toward me, mine looking carefully at the seat back opposite like it owed me money. She wasn't asleep. I did not know this yet. I knew she had a slight headache because she had rubbed her temple twice before closing her eyes. I knew her right shoulder had a tension knot she'd been working on all day because she had rotated it when she thought no one was looking. I knew her clipboard, tucked under her laptop bag, had a new annotation on the Phase 4 section because she had been reviewing it before her eyes closed. I knew these things because I noticed things about Sophie Chiang the way people notice things when they are paying attention for reasons they have not admitted to themselves. I noticed a lot of things. I was choosing, at this particular moment, to notice the seat back. My phone buzzed. A message from Callum, our project manager, asking if I had the Phase 3 handover notes somewhere accessible. I shifted to reach into my jacket pocket, which meant my shoulder moved, which meant I paused, and then I kept moving, slowly, ready to say something quiet and apologetic. She inhaled. Sharp, small, the breath of someone who is not asleep and has just had their cover nearly blown. I went completely still. She did not move. Her breathing resumed, measured, deliberate, the specific rhythm of someone performing sleep for an audience of one. My phone was still in my hand. Callum's message was still on screen. I put the phone face down on my knee and did not answer Callum. I sat there for a moment that had no appropriate length. Here is the thing about realizing someone is pretending to be asleep on your shoulder. There is no protocol. There is nothing in any professional handbook or social contract that covers this exact situation. You cannot say something. You cannot not say something. You are in a glass train car at 11 at night, watching your own reflection be a complete idiot in real time. I said nothing. She continued to not be asleep. I continued to be a man who had noticed something and was now required to decide what to do with it. I did what any reasonable person would do. I looked back at the window. I sat entirely still. I let her keep pretending for exactly 6 more minutes while I thought about everything I had decided not to think about for approximately a year and a half. I had poor survival instincts around women with bluebird mugs. The first thing I thought was, she is pretending because the alternative was being found somewhere she did not mean to be. Which meant she had been there long enough that waking naturally would have required an explanation. Which meant she had been there intentionally at some point, or had stayed intentionally at some later point, and was now committed to a version of events that required me to believe she was asleep. The second thing I thought was that I had been very stupid for a long time. There had been a moment in April when we had both stayed late to fix a contractor error, the kind of error that becomes your problem simply by virtue of being present, and she had made tea in her specific mug and set a second cup on my desk without saying anything. I had said thank you. She had said don't touch my mug. I had said I'm drinking from my own mug. She had said I'm aware and gone back to her computer. The cup had been made exactly how I drank it. I had attributed this to her paying attention to efficiency in general. There had been a Monday in July when I had arrived at the office with the specific posture of someone who had not had a good weekend. And Sophie had looked at me once over her coffee, said nothing, and then at 10 o'clock sent me a link to a new Italian place near the office with only the message, lunch, 1:15 if you want. I had gone. We had not talked about anything important. She had stolen one of my arancini without asking. I had not minded. I had not thought about why I had not minded. There had been a work drinks evening in October when a project manager from another firm had been talking at Sophie for 20 minutes in the way some men talk at women, covering her sentences, steering her opinions back toward his own, and she had had her hands wrapped around her wine glass very carefully, which was the thing she did when she was keeping herself still. I had come over and stood next to her and said nothing in particular, just stood, and he had eventually found somewhere else to be. She had looked at me afterward and said, quietly, "You have terrible timing." I had said I thought the timing was fine. She had looked at her wine. She had not argued. That was hiding with better branding. I looked at the window. She was still not asleep. Her breathing was very deliberate in a way that I now understood was the result of significant effort. The train rocked, and she shifted infinitesimally closer, and then caught herself and went still. I watched my own reflection not react. I thought. I could pretend I didn't notice. I could close my eyes and let the rest of the journey pass in a fiction that was comfortable for both of us, and we could arrive back in London, and Monday would come, and the clipboards and the timelines and the Phase 4 annotations would resume, and this would become a thing that had almost happened once on a night train, and then quietly didn't. I thought about it for almost a full minute. Then I said to the window, not loudly, "You don't have to keep pretending if you don't want to." She went very still, stiller than sleep, the kind of still that comes from a decision being made. A long moment passed. The train rocked. Outside, motorway lights swept past like long, slow breaths. She said, quietly, into my shoulder, "I'm not pretending. You inhaled wrong when I moved." Another pause. "That's not evidence of anything. You've blinked twice in the last 30 seconds. You were watching?" The window. She was quiet for a moment. Then, still not moving, "The window is a mirror." Yes, I felt her exhale. It was the exhale of someone who has held something for a long time and has just run out of a particular kind of patience. She said, "I woke up about 20 minutes ago." "I know. And I didn't move because—" She stopped. Her voice was careful the way you are careful with sentences you've practiced not saying. "Because I didn't want to." Something in my chest shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. I said, "You could have just stayed. You didn't have to perform the whole thing." She lifted her head then, sat back just enough to look at me, which required some rearrangement of the space between us that neither of us moved to create. Her face was close. The carriage was still dim. She had the expression of someone who had just lost a small private argument with themselves. "I wasn't sure," she said, "what you would do." "With what?" "With me being there. Like that. On purpose." I looked at her. She was watching me with the careful attention of someone who takes margins notes on everything, reading me the way she read project documents, looking for what the numbers didn't say. Her hands were in her lap. Her Bluebird mug was in her bag somewhere below us. I thought about April, and July, and October. I thought about a year and a half of not thinking about a year and a half. I said, "I would have sat still." She looked at me. "You did sit still." "I know." Something moved across her expression. She said, "I change your name in my phone every time I'm annoyed with you." "It's been—" She stopped. A slight pause. "It hasn't been logistics problem in a while." I waited. "It's been Daniel for about 8 months," she said quietly, "and I didn't change it back. Because I liked seeing it." That sentence did something quiet to the room. She was looking at her own hands now. Her voice was low and precise, the voice she used when she was being accurate rather than comfortable. She said, "I notice when you've had a bad week before you say anything. I notice when you're about to push back on one of my timelines because you do this thing with your pen. I notice." She stopped again. "I have been noticing things about you for a long time, Daniel, and I have been telling myself it was because we work together, and it is professionally useful to understand the people you work with." She looked up. "It isn't that," she said. I looked at her for a long moment. The train rocked. My reflection in the window looked like a man who had been carrying something he hadn't noticed the weight of until just now. I said, "If you wanted to sit back where you were," I stopped. I started again. "If you wanted to stay there, you could. I'm not going to make it strange." She looked at me with an expression I didn't have a word for. "You're giving me an exit," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I want you to choose," I said. "Not because the train swayed or the lights were dim or it just sort of happened. I want you to." She moved back to my shoulder before I'd finished the sentence. Deliberately, settling there like she was making a point. She said, "Into my jacket. I'm choosing." I let out a breath I had been holding for approximately 8 months. I said, "The Italian place in July." You already knew how I drank my coffee. I've known how you drink your coffee since March of last year. That's a very long time to know how someone drinks their coffee. Yes. she said. It is. I put my arm around her. Slowly, she didn't move away. The train rocked. Outside, the motorway lights were gone and there was just the dark countryside coming and going. Something in my chest was doing a thing I did not have existing vocabulary for. I thought, every person I'd been with before this had felt like a conversation I was half attending. She had felt, for a year and a half, like a conversation I had been paying attention to without meaning to. I said, I notice when you're about to say something and decide not to. You get very still. I know. I noticed it before I knew that I noticed it. She was quiet for a moment. When something went wrong at work, I said, you were the person I wanted to talk to first. I told myself it was because you knew the context. But then I started noticing I wanted to tell you when something went right, too. And the context didn't explain that. No, she said. It didn't. We stayed like that until London. Her sister called when we stepped onto the platform. Sophie answered and said, yes, she was back, yes, fine, and then turned slightly away to say something in a lower voice. And I heard her sister's voice from the phone say, with the sharpness of someone who has been updated, so it finally happened? And Sophie said, quickly, call you tomorrow, and hung up, and turned back to me with the expression of someone who has been informed by her own phone call that this was not a surprise to anyone but us. I said, how long has your sister known? Sophie looked at the middle distance. Since March, she said, of last year. I had poor survival instincts. Confirmed. 3 months later, her Bluebird mug had a companion on the shelf, above the kitchen counter. A gray one, chipped at the rim, because I had poor coordination and good intentions. She had looked at it when I put it there, and said nothing for a moment. Then she had said, don't chip mine. I had said, I would try. She had looked at her mug, and then at me, and the look had been the kind that required no translation. 8 months after that, her mother asked how we got together, at a Sunday lunch I had been slightly underprepared for. Sophie said, without any particular performance, we were on a train. I said, she pretended to be asleep on my shoulder. Her mother looked between us. Sophie said, he noticed. Her mother nodded like this, explained something she had been waiting a long time to have explained. 2 years later, people would ask us how we met, and Sophie would say, badly, at a work briefing. When I was right, and he was wrong, I would say, well, and on a night train, when she was pretending to be asleep. She would say, I was almost asleep. I would say, you inhaled wrong, and she would look at me with that expression. The one I had first seen in the window of a late train going south. The one I had not had words for then, and did not need words for now. And nothing else would need to be said. It had probably always been her. It had just taken a night train, and a controlled exhale, and a woman who noticed how I drank my coffee 8 months before I knew what that meant. Nothing important had appeared overnight. It had simply stopped hiding. What would you have done if someone you worked with pretended to be asleep just to stay close to you? And you knew. And have you ever realized you'd been noticing someone for months before you let yourself admit what it meant? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.